Trump's promise to commute Ross's sentence was made during a rally in 2024 when he explicitly stated that Ross had been treated unfairly and deserved a chance at freedom. Now, this isn't about Trump's stance on cryptocurrency or his politics or political alignments. It's not. It's about a promise to correct a clear injustice. We can't lose focus on that promise. A man's life literally depends on it, and it's up to all of us to keep that promise, right? Trump said that he would do it, and I think we should all hold him accountable to that. Ross's case has become a symbol of everything wrong with how nonviolent offenders are treated. So Trump just basically got elected as president of the United States. And one of his first promises that he had made a while back was on day one that he would be commuting Ross Ulbricht's sentence. And this really isn't so much about giving people hope. It's more about correcting a severe injustice. Ross was the creator of Silk Road and is currently serving a double life sentence plus 40 years with no parole, which is completely over the top for a guy who simply made a website and managed it. Now, keep in mind, he was a nonviolent criminal, first-time offender, all that stuff. So for those that are unfamiliar, Ross was a pioneer in the Darknet creating Silk Road, which was a online marketplace on the Darknet where users could buy and sell goods, including illegal goods, using Bitcoin. Before Silk Road, the only similar marketplace was called the Farmers Market, but it lacked the same scale and kind of innovation that Ross actually had. It also didn't use crypto at all. Silk Road launched in early 2011 and became famous pretty quick, as it operated beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement. It was kind of like an alien to them, like a strange creature from another planet in some ways. It was something that they had basically not interacted with really before that. Ross's vision was rooted in libertarian ideas, and he was very much into things like individual freedom, privacy, voluntary exchange without government interference. Ross was also deeply influenced by Agorism as a result. I, too, am an Agorist. Basically, it's a philosophy that advocates for things like counter-economic activity as a means to create a society free from as much state control or state control in general. Agorism is a philosophy that originated from the writings of Samuel Koken. I might have mispronounced his name, but whatever. In the 1970s, basically, it's a libertarian-based ideology that focuses on achieving a society free from government coercion through direct action in the counter-economy. The counter-economy refers to all economic activity that's either illegal or operates outside of the state's purview, thus bypassing state control and regulation. It could be a darknet market or it could be a local handyman. So to put it simply, if you value individual freedom, oppose the state's interference in personal choice, and believe that participating in free voluntary markets is a way to push back against state power, you might be an agorist. Agorists basically engage in activities that are peaceful but may be considered also illegal, using cryptocurrency, trading without a license, or selling prohibited goods, with the aim at minimizing the state involvement and exposing the state's inability to actually control all economic behavior. Unlike traditional anarchism, which I see a lot of people meld and kind of try to mold, a lot of people end up putting both of those together. Anarchism often, in my opinion, revolves around like dismantling the state through political action, or even in some cases violent revolution, while agorism takes a far more subversive and strategic approach. Agorism is more about rendering the state obsolete, not by confronting it head on, which is exactly what they want, in my opinion, but by a parallel economic system that can outcompete it, essentially. So it's really opting out entirely, voluntarily, and building alternative markets, prove the state's irrelevance and incompetence. This is also, you could do this just by bartering with your neighbors. Privacy coins like XMR are also really good examples of agorism in actual action. They allow people to exchange value without these states' prying eyes, taking away its power to surveil and control financial interactions, which they always make a profit off of, usually to fund the surveillance. So it's a mean circle, really, at the end of the day. Agorists aren't interested typically in things like, begging for permission or lobbying for change. I would argue, as someone who is an agorist, that a lot of us tend to have some severe issues with authority. They tend to bypass the state entirely whenever possible, providing that a society based on voluntary, peaceful exchange is not only possible, but superior, and if nothing else, preferable. It's about making the government irrelevant one transaction at a time. Voting with your money, we'll say. Peaceful non-participation is the most powerful form of resistance, and it hits the state where it hurts. And its wallet, its ability to exert control and extract resources is a big resource in and of itself, and it's turned into the primary motive of the state as opposed to protecting our rights. I know I'm getting a little sidetracked here with the agorism, but I think it's important to kind of understand the mindset that I really think that Ross had. I don't think it was an evil mindset at all, but economically opting out is an act of revolution. And it's the kind of revolution that doesn't need firearms or political rallies. It just needs individuals choosing to conduct their lives without coercion. Silk Road was a perfect agorist experiment because it really embodied these practices, right? Ross wasn't advocating violent overthrow, direct confrontation with the state. Instead, he was offering a peaceful way to bypass it by creating where transactions could occur voluntarily, anonymously to some degree back then, and without government oversight. Ross basically putting an agorist philosophy into practice, and the use of cryptocurrency like Bitcoin was very important because it basically allowed people to exchange value without banks or like the government acting as intermediaries, which definitely fits perfectly with the agorist vision of counter-economics in general. So he saw Silk Road, from what I've heard him talk about, as a way to reduce violence typically associated with things like drug transactions by taking the market out of the streets and into an anonymous online space. Using cryptocurrency as a medium of exchange made these transactions safer and thus eliminated the physical damage or danger that's very inherent in drug trafficking. By moving these exchanges to online marketplaces, Ross believed that he could create a system that minimized harm, a key tenet of the agorist philosophy. The idea was to allow people to make their own choices, free from things like violent enforcement seen in conventional black markets, which definitely showed that voluntary peaceful trade could exist even in prohibited areas. By 2013, Ross's trailblazing experiment had drawn the full force of law enforcement. The downfall of being a trailblazer is drawing all of the heat, making all the first mistakes, because you have no prior examples to go off from, right? So you pay the highest price too, because they want to make an example of you. Now, Ross was actually arrested in October of 2013 at Glen Park branch of the San Francisco Public Library. The FBI chose a quiet library full of innocent bystanders to make their move, turning a peaceful, quiet public space into a chaotic scene. And I think it was a cowardly move, and it was definitely a heavy-handed operation that really made zero tactical sense when you think about it. They could have arrested Ross quietly, catching him on his way home in a less public place, but they actually wanted to make a spectacle. They wanted to paint him as a dangerous criminal, but all they really did, confront a guy who's sitting at is minding his own business. It was all about making him look like a threat. Any dude that you actually have to raid at a library is probably not going to throwing pineapple grenades at you or have a machine gun, in his trapper keeper. The FBI definitely, in my opinion, went overboard with these actions, and it just kind of reeked of desperation. Trying to turn a librarian-level arrest into a takedown, some warlord or something. It was just absolutely security theater, in my opinion. Now, By 2015, Ross had been tried and sentenced to double life plus 40 years, a punishment so extreme that it stunned not only his supporters, but also a ton of actual neutral observers in the legal field. Ross had no history of violence, wasn't even a drug trafficker, or a violent criminal. He was just a first-time offender whose crime was building a website. Yet the prosecutor pursued him relentlessly and was clearly determined to make him into a symbol, a warning to others who might dare innovate outside of the state's control. Also, no doubt, probably for his political career, as many United States attorneys and assistant United States attorneys go try to become senators. The punishment simply didn't fit the crime, though, and it's a fundamental principle of justice that sentencing should be proportional to the offense. But in Ross's case, this principle was blatantly disregarded and pushed aside. The prosecution leaned on heavy, unproven allegations, exaggerated narratives, and sensationalism to ensure that he received an extreme penalty. It was challenging the state's power over markets, and they'll bury you. And this definitely is not an isolated case. There's a very, very clear history of people just getting brutally crushed by United States attorneys or prosecutors who abuse their powers in some cases, manipulate using fear to get end results. Aaron Swartz is a great example, who was the co-founder of Reddit, before it became a cesspool of censorship. And he was threatened with 35 years in prison for downloading academic articles. That level of punishment is so harsh, it pushed him to take his own life, unfortunately. The state used him to send a message about the consequences of questioning digital access control to their documents, as it was over Pacer. Chelsea Manning's another great example. She received 35 years for exposing things like U.S. military conduct, including things like war crimes, like killing of civilians in Iraq. She had revealed uncomfortable truths, and for that, she was brutally punished with decades behind bars. The state's aim is always very, very clear, to deter anyone from daring to expose their secrets. Edward Snowden, for example, still faces decades in prison for revealing mass surveillance abuses by the NSA. Both were basically punished, not for causing harm, but to deter anyone who might challenge the state's authority. Martin Luther King Jr. is another example. He was targeted by COINTELPRO. He was subjugated to intimidation and harassment by the FBI to do things like the Black Panthers also were systematically dismantled by law enforcement, often framed or just killed outright simply because they represented a challenge at the time to what was the status quo. John Kiriakou, a CIA whistleblower, was imprisoned for exposing the agency's torture program, while those who authorized and carried out the actual torture of individuals were able to walk freely. Now, each of these individuals was punished, again, not for causing harm, but for exposing what the government was doing, for exposing the corruption that was behind it, and for innovating beyond government reach in some cases. Standing up to power, basically. They were examples, warnings, essentially, to all those who might think of also stepping out of line. Ross's double life sentence follows this same pattern. It wasn't about justice, it was about control. And the government wanted to make an example out of him, crushing him with an extreme sentence to maintain power over those who seek to innovate or challenge established systems. Of course, it didn't work. It ended up backfiring with the actual takedown of Silk Road. It was a hydra. They cut off one head and three grew back, essentially. And we've been playing that game ever since. Ross was also an intelligent, really driven individual who cared about creating a positive impact. And I would say that he did create a positive impact, that is. Before Silk Road, he pursued a master's degree in materials science and engineering at Penn State University. He was an Eagle Scout. He had a passion for physics and libertarian philosophies, basically. Friends and family described him as caring and idealistic. driven by a genuine desire to make the world a freer place. The way he was portrayed during the trial was as a ruthless kingpin, and it just could not have been further from reality if you had Stephen King write it. Silk Road itself operated without violence. Transactions happened online with cryptocurrency and anonymity, which actually reduced physical dangers, typically that are associated with drug trafficking, like we discussed before. Still, Ross was painted as a kingpin and treated like a violent mastermind. The trial that Kangaroo Court actually held was absolutely clear. The authorities wanted to send that message. And the way Ross was caught is a textbook example of unethical law enforcement tactics and outright corruption. The FBI used methods to locate Silk Road servers that had never fully been explained, leading to serious suspicions of illegal surveillance. To this day, the FBI has never properly accounted for how they actually gained access, or nowhere that I actually saw. I could absolutely be wrong about that, but I haven't seen it. There are strong indications from what I did see that they've used things warrantless and otherwise unlawful surveillance methods. And there's been outright criminal behavior of the investigators. I mean, for example, the DEA agent, Carl Force, and the Secret Service agent, Sean Bridges, were not only involved in things that were shady, they were outright stealing from the Silk Road during the investigation. Like, these agents that were actually meant to uphold the law instead exploited their positions. And what they ended up doing was siphoning off really large amounts of Bitcoin for themselves. They were both convicted for their crimes. Ross's trial barely mentioned that glaring corruption. The fact that key investigators were themselves criminals kind of should have been the front and center in the trial, yet it was swept under the rug, which is not surprising, but it definitely raises some fundamental questions when we have this discussion about fairness and integrity of the entire process, which there is none. And that was a deliberate attempt to try to obscure the actual truth and railroad Ross without giving him a fair shot. Now, Ross's trial was also fundamentally unfair as well. The defense was blocked from just basic things like cross-examining key witnesses and evidence that could have been potentially exonerating for Ross, or reduced his culpability, or his sentence was just outright suppressed. And on top of that, unproven allegations about Ross's involvement in a murder-for-hire plots were also mentioned during the trial to try and sway the jury, even though those allegations were never formally actually prosecuted. These kind of tactics painted Ross in the absolute worst possible light without giving him a fair chance to defend himself. Now, after his conviction, Ross was initially sent to ADX Florence, which is a supermax prison reserved for the most dangerous criminals in the world, like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and El Chapo, right? ADX Florence is infamous for brutal conditions, 23 hours solitary, almost no interaction with other inmates or human beings in some cases, and severely restricted contact with the outside world when it's allowed. Placing Ross there was absolutely overkill. He was a nonviolent offender, yet he was treated like an absolute terrorist. And in 2017, Ross was transferred to USP Tucson, which is a maximum security facility and not as severe as ADX. USP Tucson is still a really dangerous place with frequent stabbings and very violent things that happen. Completely inappropriate setting. Ross, who made a website, he's never been a violent criminal. Meanwhile, others that were actually involved with Silk or similar darknet marketplaces received far lighter sentences. Peter Nash, who was a key figure in Silk Road's operation, got 10 years. Gary Davis got 6.5 years. And even Blake Benthal, who ran Silk Road 2.0, didn't face anything close to Ross's punishment. And that was because he turned snitch, but that's a whole nother story. Ross was absolutely made an example of, treated far more harshly than anyone else involved. Let's be clear, Ross wasn't selling drugs himself. He was a developer who created the platform. He enforced rules against things like cheese pizza and stolen goods, violence and stuff like that. His actions were questionable. Yeah, sure. Life in prison is a completely disproportionate response. Several public figures have even openly criticized Ross's sentence. Rand Paul has repeatedly stated that Ross's punishment was unjust, pointing out it was more about making an example of him than delivering fair justice, something I absolutely agree with. Former Libertarian president candidate Gary Johnson has also called it a grotesque misuse of governmental power. Congressman Thomas Massey has also voiced his support, emphasizing that the sentence is completely out of line for a nonviolent offender. These aren't like fringe voices, right? These are respected figures in positions of power who understand how fundamentally broken the justice system is, but especially how Ross's case is such a great example of that. Trump's promise to commute Ross's sentence was made during a rally in 2024.
Today, I repeat my pledge to commute the sentence of Ross Ulbricht to a sentence of time served. It's enough. It's enough.
Now, this isn't about Trump's stance on cryptocurrency or his politics or political alignments. It's not. It's about a promise to correct a clear injustice. We can't lose focus on that promise. A man's life literally depends on it, and it's up to all of us to keep that promise, right? Trump said that he would do it, and I think we should all hold him accountable to that. Ross's case has become a symbol of everything wrong with how nonviolent offenders are treated. It absolutely shows prosecutorial misconduct, a lack of a fair process, and a system that punishes innovation more harshly than actual violent crimes. Ross's freedom isn't just about him. It's about challenging the injustice that plagues our criminal injustice system. Now is the time that we really need to remember that he said on day one he would do this. We need to remind people of Trump's promise and make sure that he absolutely keeps it. We need to share Ross's story. And again, this Trump being president or any of that, like I literally woke up at 3:30 in the morning, saw the results of the election, and then went to work making this video. That's how important I think it is that this actually happens and that people remember this and they bring it up. And I really hope that in the long run, Ross gets to see the light of day instead of being in a 6x9 with murders and whack jobs. In any case, thank you for watching to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.